So, Andre, what I wanted to ask you, in our last conversation, you mentioned a clinical trial where 6 humans had major organ failure as a result of trying a drug that had gone through preclinical trial. I wanted to ask you, how does that actually happen, and how many elements are there of a preclinical trial?
Okay, so to get a new drug onto the market takes between 10 and 12 years.
Yeah.
It's going to cost the manufacturer between £500 million and £1 billion. And it begins in the laboratory analyzing thousands, maybe tens of thousands of molecules, looking for a molecule that has some effect on a biological process in the body.
Mm-hmm.
And then by a process of selection, so based on the shape of the molecule, and if that molecule resembles other molecules that are already on the market, the manufacturer will then test it on, for example, cells, could be human cells, and then ultimately get to the stage where it has to be tested on a complex living organism. And the manufacturer traditionally will test on animals.
Mm-hmm.
And traditionally,
is an animal at this stage considered to be the only complex living organism?
Yes, yes, that is what will be used. Normally, rats,
Mm-hmm.
either dogs or monkeys.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really the last safety net before the drug is tested on humans in clinical trials. Clinical trials consist of 4 phases. The first phase is the use of healthy human volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
The second phase is the use of a small group of patients, perhaps 100 or 200. The third phase will be a larger group of patients, so maybe 2,000 to 3,000. And the fourth phase will actually be the release of the drug onto the market and pharmacovigilance. In other words, seeing what happens to the general population.
Mm-hmm. So is then the final portal, if you like, for this test to go through an animal portal?
Yes, the final safety net,
Yes.
before clinical trials begin, invariably is the use of animals.
And if as is fully, it seems to be fully accepted, I read this morning that they now think that it's a 96% failure rate and using animals as a model in this way. Why are they still using animals?
Okay, so this format was adopted at the end of the Second World War, around 1946. And at the time, it seemed to make sense that before you try anything on a human, in other words, human experimentation, you first test it on everything available. And everything available at the time was cell culture in petri dishes and animals. And so that may have seemed and sounded reasonable in 1946. It is certainly not reasonable in 2025.
Yes. So absolutely understood. I would still ask the same question then. Why are they still using animals as this final portal for safety when it has proved to be so ineffective?
Okay, so the regulatory authorities in the UK, it would be the MHRA. In the United States, it would be the FDA. They allow the pharmaceutical industry to choose the method that they want to prove that the drug is A, safe, and B, effective. How they do that is left to the pharmaceutical industry. So the pharmaceutical industry for the past 75 years have been submitting animal data to the regulatory authorities in the knowledge that 9 out of 10 times, the animal tests fail to predict safety and efficacy. The regulatory authorities are also aware of this, but this has gone on for 75 years. Now, if the pharmaceutical industry wishes to replace animal testing with 21st century technology, such as human organs on chips, they will then have to convince the regulatory authorities that the 21st century non-animal test method is at least as good, as effective as the animal tests, or better. Now, the human organ on a chip has already done that. In other words, there is sufficient scientific evidence to show that these human organs on chips are far, far more predictive of human outcome than the animal tests. But they have to go through a regulatory acceptance process. Now, that has begun already in the United States. It has already begun in the United States. I would say the United States are well ahead of Europe and the UK.
But are they not in the United States using the phase-out policy? So they're reckoning to have it phased out by 2035. Is that not what the FDA is following? And also, this is what confuses me, Andre. I'm sorry, and I'm not a scientist, but if they all agree that it's a 90 to 96% failure rate in animals, why is the pharmaceutical industry still trying to convince politicians and people who agree money for this kind of research? Why are they still trying to convince them when it is a failed system?
The pharmaceutical industry recognizes that they can't keep peddling animal tests. So what they are doing now, it's this damage control. Damage control is to try and buy as much time as possible. So, for example, the Dutch Minister of Agriculture in 2016 set out a roadmap to replace large chunks of animal testing by 2025. So we could have had large chunks of animal testing replaced this year, but because of pressure from the pharmaceutical industry, the government had to back down. So the technology has been there for at least 10 years. So what the pharmaceutical industry is doing now is they are saying, just give us another 10 years and we will replace these animal tests.
So this is all driven, the 3 Rs, this whole policy is driven by the pharmaceutical industry, who, if it costs 1 billion to 20 billion and 10 years to produce a new drug, and there is a 90% failure rate using animal tests, and the animal tests for each animal must be in the region, I think I read somewhere, for one animal, £50,000 or dollars per year for each animal, and they're testing in America on millions of animals. That surely is such a total waste of money and time. Now, is it because the money that is paid for this animal research comes through the government coffers and therefore is paid for by public money through taxes? Or is the pharmaceutical industry funding this itself?
I would say the pharmaceutical industry is largely funding this itself. You must realize that when we're talking about pharmaceutical industry, we're talking billions. We're not talking millions.
Yes.
And what the pharmaceutical industry is looking for is what is called a blockbuster drug. So it is a drug that will be sold to millions and billions of people, things that people need to take for life. That is the ideal drug for the pharmaceutical industry. And so by using animal tests, even with a huge failure rate of 96%, it still allows them to get sufficient drugs onto the market. It allows them a pipeline to still get drugs onto the market in the hope that some of those will be blockbusters and will provide a revenue of not millions, but billions.
I'm sorry, but I'm still confused here, so forgive me, Andre. The results of using animals as models as a predictive process for human diseases fails 96% of the time. There are now more modern scientific alternatives that have a far greater success rate in that predictive process. Is that right?
Yes, but it reduces the pipeline. Don't forget, Peter, it reduces the number of candidate drugs that will get onto the market. By using animal tests, let's say, the pharmaceutical industry can get 10 new drugs onto the market. Yes, they will have side effects, but they can get their 10 new drugs. If they use human organs on chips and similar 21st century technology, they may only get 1 or 2 new drugs onto the market because the technology will weed out a lot of those other drugs that might have got onto the market because they will flag up serious adverse drug reactions.
So this sounds really extraordinary, Andre, that the pharmaceutical industry is gambling with people's health in order to get a financial return by producing, as you say, for instance, 10 new drugs as opposed to 2, because the 2 that would get through this system, if they used modern science, would be much more successful for humans, but less successful for their investment, is how I'm reading that.
That's totally right. And the public and even the shareholders in the pharmaceutical industry don't know this. They're either naive or they simply don't know the facts.
And does government know the facts? Because surely if I get the facts, a member of government must get the facts as well.
You're only getting the facts, Peter, because I'm giving you the facts. Most MPs get their knowledge, their information about the pharmaceutical industry and about animal testing from what they hear and see on mainstream media. And that is why whenever I give a talk at a high school or university, I semi-jokingly say to the students at the end of my talk that they now know more about animal experimentation than the general public, most politicians, and even their own GP.
That's terrifying, Andre. And I might say thank you for sharing this information with me because it is fascinating. So, okay, let's talk about the recent Herbies law that was went through a hearing in the House of Commons on I think the 30th of April, or a debate. Now, was the result of that totally predictable in your opinion?
Well, Herbies law on the surface sounds great because Herbies law calls for the phasing out of animal testing, large chunks of animal testing. But the only problem is by 2035. So what Herbies law in effect is doing is providing a lifeline to the chemical industry, to the pharmaceutical industry, to animal researchers, telling them you're fine for the next 10 years. You can carry on doing what you're doing for the next 10 years because we are going to embed this in law. And there's nothing to stop the government or industry in 9 years' time saying, oh, we've decided we can't make the deadline. We're going to extend it for another few years. We should not be so naive as to believe industry when they say to us, we are going to end animal experimentation in 10 years. We should not be so naive as to believe them. And of course, there's no guarantee that this bill will even pass into law. And it may take months and perhaps years for this bill to pass into law, which then gives even more time to the pharmaceutical industry and animal researchers.
Mm-hmm. So would it be right also for me to say that with the three R's as a policy that came into being in the late 50s, so now over 70, excuse me, over 70 years ago, has that facilitated a phasing out process rather than an ending process for these 70 years? Or has the phasing out of animal, being the use of animals as models for human diseases, has that policy only developed from the point of more modern science related to the problem, if that makes sense?
So the policy of the three R's, reduction, refinement, replacement, was suggested in 1959 by Russell and Birch. And at the time, it made a lot of sense. And ironically, it was ignored by the scientific community. And it was only in the 1980s that it was picked up by the animal rights and the animal protection community, who thought it was fantastic. And they started promoting it. So it's ironic that the three R's was historically promoted by the animal rights and the animal protection community. And then straight away, the animal research community seized upon this and said, yes, the three R's is the way to go. It's great. Now, historically, this was proposed, this concept, this principle of the three R's was proposed in 1959. Since then, science has moved forward. And so one could argue that the three R's is no longer fit for purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're looking at is the full R of replacement only, not reduction, not refinement. That may have been relevant in 1959. It is no longer relevant today.
Mm-hmm. So in effect then, once the vivisection community picked up on the three R's in the 80s, this, for want of a better image, process of phasing out has been going on for 45 years then.
Exactly. The pharmaceutical industry, the chemical industry have had, well, they've had 75 years since the end of the Second World War, which is when animal experimentation was enshrined in preclinical testing. So they had 75 years, and they've had all the time since 1959 to change their ways. They have done nothing.
So what, in your opinion then, Andre, what is the future? How does one deal with the future as far as this is concerned? If it is, as you have suggested, basically investment finance based in terms of the pharmaceutical industry, that they can get more drugs on the market each year by using the portal of animal testing, they're clearly not going to stop that for 10 years. What is your answer? Do you have an answer to this?
I think that the genie is out of the bottle, in the sense that 21st century technology is now available, readily available. It's now up to people like you and me to inform the general public, to inform the politicians of the good news, and to accelerate the transition from animal testing to human-based research. And that doesn't take 10 years. It doesn't take 5 years. It can happen now. It's simply a question of making people aware, mobilizing public opinion, and also informing shareholders in the pharmaceutical industry and the chemical industry, because I think they will be as shocked as you are once they receive this information.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andre. That's really terrific. Thank you.